Darlie Routier was a 26-year-old mother living in Rowlett, Texas with her husband Darren and 3 young sons. The family appeared to have it all: a nice home, successful business, and what seemed like the perfect life. But on June 6, 1996, that image shattered forever. In the early morning hours, Darlie called 911 screaming that someone had broken into their home. When police arrived, they found a horrific scene. Her 2 sons, 6-year-old Devon and 5-year-old Damon, had been unalived with a large kitchen knife. Darlie herself had wounds on her neck and arm. She told officers that an intruder dressed in dark clothes had attacked them while she slept on the couch downstairs. Her youngest son, 8-month-old Drake, was upstairs and unharmed. The story seemed believable at first, but investigators quickly noticed things that did not add up. The supposed point of entry showed no real signs of forced entry. The family's expensive jewelry and other valuables were untouched. Most disturbing was Darlie's behavior. At her son's memorial service just days later, she was filmed laughing, chewing gum, and spraying silly string on their graves while singing "Happy Birthday" to Devon. Police focused on a bloody sock found 75 yards from the Routier home. Darlie claimed the intruder dropped it while fleeing, but investigators believed she planted it there herself to support her story. They also questioned her wounds. Doctors said they were superficial and could have been self-inflicted. The wound on her neck missed major arteries by just 2 millimeters, leading prosecutors to argue she tried to end her own life, but lost courage. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by debt and 3 young children. The family business was failing, and they owed $10,000 on credit cards. Darlie had been taking diet pills and acting strangely in the weeks before the incident. They argued she unalived her sons in a moment of rage and desperation, then staged the break-in to cover her tracks. Darlie's defense team fought back. They pointed to evidence of an intruder, including fingerprints that did not match the family. They argued the sock could not have been planted by Darlie because she would not have had time. They said her behavior at the memorial service showed how people grieve differently, not guilt. The trial began in January 1997 in Carterville, Texas. The prosecution's case centered on the lack of evidence for an intruder and Darlie's suspicious behavior. The defense struggled to explain away the blood evidence and her changing story about what happened that night. After deliberating for several hours, the jury found Darlie Routier guilty of capital offense in February 1997. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She was also charged with Devon's death, but has never been tried for that offense, as prosecutors felt the first conviction was sufficient. Darlie has been on death row for over 25 years, maintaining her innocence. Her case has attracted significant attention from those who believe she was wrongfully convicted. They point to DNA evidence that was never fully tested and questions about the investigation. Her appeals continue, and she remains in the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. Lisa Jo Chamberlin was a 31-year-old woman from Mississippi who became involved with Roger Lee Gillett, a man with a violent criminal history. In March 2004, their relationship would lead to horrific incidents that shocked law enforcement across multiple states. Gillett had been having disputes with his cousin Vernon Hillett over money and personal issues. Hillett was a 30-year-old man who had been staying at a farm property in Russell County, Kansas. Linda Heinzelman, a 47-year-old woman, was also at the property and became an unintended individual affected in Gillett's violent plan. On March 13, 2004, Chamberlin and Gillett traveled to Kansas, where Gillett planned to confront Hillett. What started as a confrontation quickly turned deadly when Gillett unalived both Hillett and Heinzelman at the remote farm location. Chamberlin participated in the violence that took both individuals' lives. After the offenses, Chamberlin and Gillett made the horrific decision to dismember both bodies to hide evidence of their incidents. They cut up the remains and stored the body parts in a freezer at the abandoned farm property. The couple then fled Kansas, believing they had successfully hidden their actions. The investigation began when Hillett and Heinzelman were reported missing by concerned family members. Police traced their last known location to the farm in Russell County. When investigators searched the property, they made the gruesome discovery of dismembered human remains stored in the freezer. Forensic experts identified the remains as belonging to Hillett and Heinzelman. Both individuals had been unalived before their bodies were dismembered. The evidence showed that this was not a random incident, but a planned attack involving people known to the individuals affected. Police quickly identified Gillett and Chamberlin as suspects based on witness testimony and evidence at the scene. The couple was arrested and charged with capital offense. Both faced the death penalty for their roles in the brutal incidents. Chamberlin was convicted of capital offense and sentenced to death by lethal injection. She has been on death row in Mississippi for nearly 20 years, with her appeals largely unsuccessful. Her case represents one of the most disturbing incidents in recent Mississippi history due to the dismemberment and desecration of the individuals affected. Blanche Taylor Moore seemed like the kind of woman any man would want to marry. Born in 1933, she was charming, attractive, and appeared to be the perfect Southern lady. She worked as a store clerk and later in office jobs, always presenting herself as sweet and caring. But beneath her pleasant exterior, Moore was one of America's most calculated serial poisoners. Moore's first husband was James Napoleon Taylor, whom she married in 1952. They had 2 daughters together, and seemed to have a normal marriage for over 20 years. But in 1973, Taylor became mysteriously ill. He suffered from stomach problems, weakness, and other symptoms that doctors could not explain. Taylor passed away in 1973, at age 45. At the time his death was attributed to a heart attack. After Taylor's death, Moore collected his life insurance and began looking for a new husband. She soon met Reverend Dwight Moore, a Methodist minister who was recently widowed. The couple married in 1981, and Dwight seemed to have found the perfect wife to help him in his ministry work. But within months of their marriage, Dwight Moore began experiencing the same mysterious symptoms that had plagued Moore's first husband. He suffered severe stomach pain, vomiting, hair loss, and extreme weakness. Doctors were baffled by his condition. Dwight became so sick that he had to retire from his ministry. Meanwhile, Moore had also been in relationships with other men who experienced similar health problems. Raymond Reed, a man she had been dating before marrying Dwight, had passed away in 1986 after months of illness. Like the others, Reed had suffered stomach problems and weakness that doctors could not explain. The pattern became clear when Dwight Moore's condition continued to worsen. In 1989, suspicious doctors finally tested him for poison. The results were shocking. Dwight had extremely high levels of arsenic in his system. He had been slowly poisoned over years of marriage. Police immediately began investigating Dwight Moore. When they exhumed the bodies of James Taylor and Raymond Reed, they found both men had died from arsenic poisoning. Moore had been systematically poisoning the men in her life for over 15 years. The investigation revealed Moore's method. She would gradually add small amounts of arsenic to her victims' food and drinks over long periods. This caused chronic poisoning that mimicked other illnesses, making it difficult for doctors to diagnose. Moore was patient and methodical, slowly increasing the doses until her victims passed away. Authorities discovered that Moore had purchased arsenic-based ant poison on multiple occasions. She would extract the arsenic and mix it into food, particularly items like oatmeal, coffee, and soup that would mask the taste. Moore had turned cooking, traditionally an act of love and care, into a weapon. The motive appeared to be financial gain combined with a desire to control the men in her life. Moore collected life insurance payouts from her deceased husbands and boyfriends. She also seemed to enjoy the power she held over these men, playing the role of devoted caregiver while secretly causing their suffering. Moore was arrested in 1989 and charged with first-degree offense in the death of Raymond Reed. Prosecutors decided to focus on Reed's case because the evidence was strongest. They also charged her with attempting to take the life of Dwight Moore, who survived thanks to the medical intervention that discovered the poisoning. During her trial in 1990, the prosecution presented evidence of Moore's pattern of behavior. They showed how multiple men in her life had died or become seriously ill from arsenic poisoning. Experts testified about how arsenic works as a poison, and how Moore had administered it over long periods. Moore's defense team argued that she was not capable of such calculated violence. They portrayed her as a loving woman who had been devoted to her husbands, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury found Blanche Moore guilty of first-degree offense and attempted first-degree offense. The jury recommended death, and the judge sentenced Blanche Moore to death by lethal injection. At age 57, she became one of the oldest women ever sentenced to death in North Carolina. Moore has been on death row for over 30 years and is now in her 90s, making her one of the oldest individuals on death row in America. She has exhausted most of her appeals and remains at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Her case stands as one of the most chilling examples of domestic poisoning in American criminal history. Linda Anita Carty was a 42-year-old woman born in St. Kitts who had become a naturalized British citizen before moving to Houston, Texas. Carty had no prior criminal record and worked as a laborer to support herself. But by 2001 she was facing personal problems that would lead her to make a desperate and deadly decision. Carty was involved in a relationship that was falling apart. Her boyfriend was threatening to leave her and she believed that having a baby might convince him to stay. But Carty was not pregnant and could not have children naturally. Instead of accepting this reality, she began planning to steal someone else's baby and claim it as her own. Carty specifically wanted a Latino baby to match her own background. She began looking for a target and found 20-year-old Jonah Rodriguez, a young mother who had just given birth to a baby boy named Ray. Rodriguez lived in Houston with her husband and had no connection to Carty, making her a seemingly random target. On the evening of May 15, 2001, Carty put her plan into action. She recruited 3 men, Chris Robinson, Gerald Anderson, and Carlos William, to help her carry out the kidnapping. The group planned to invade Rodriguez's home, take the baby, and eliminate any witnesses who could identify them. At approximately 1 a.m. on May 16, 2001, Carty and her accomplices forced their way into Rodriguez's home. Rodriguez's husband and his cousin were pistol-whipped and bound with duct tape while the intruders searched for the baby. The home invasion was violent and terrifying for the family members who were present. Carty and her accomplices found Rodriguez and her 3-day-old son Ray. They kidnapped both mother and baby, taking them from the house while leaving the bound men behind. Rodriguez was forced to come with them because she was breastfeeding the baby, and Carty needed her to keep the infant alive until she could figure out how to care for him herself. The kidnapping quickly became even more deadly. Rather than just taking the baby and releasing Rodriguez somewhere, Carty and her accomplices decided that Rodriguez knew too much and could identify them to police. They made the decision to eliminate her permanently to prevent her from reporting the incident. Rodriguez was taken to a remote location where she was unalived by the group. The young mother was eliminated so that Carty could steal her newborn son. Baby Ray was left motherless at just 3 days old, taken by strangers who had no idea how to properly care for an infant. Carty's plan began falling apart almost immediately. As police were scouring the city for Rodriguez and her son, Carty's name quickly came up as a suspect. The 3 men she had recruited were known to police and had connections that led investigators directly to Carty. When police found Carty with baby Ray, she tried to claim that the child was hers. She had no documentation to prove this and could not explain where she had given birth or provide any medical records. The baby was clearly not receiving proper care, and Carty had no idea how to feed or care for a newborn infant. The investigation revealed that Carty had been planning the kidnapping for some time. She had been asking people about families with newborn babies and had been researching how to care for infants. The 3 men she recruited quickly confessed to their involvement and implicated Carty as the mastermind of the plot. Carty claimed she was framed by her co-defendants, who were drug dealers, because she had previously been an informant. She insisted that she had not been involved in the kidnapping and offense, and that the 3 men were trying to shift blame onto her. But the evidence contradicted her claims of innocence. Carty was arrested and charged with capital offense for the death of Jonah Rodriguez. The prosecution's theory was that Carty had arranged to have 3 acquaintances take the life of Rodriguez in order to steal her 3-day-old baby and claim it as her own, apparently hoping to persuade her boyfriend not to leave her. The trial began in 2002, with the prosecution presenting evidence of Carty's role in planning and carrying out the kidnapping and offense. The 3 accomplices testified against her and received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation. They described how Carty had recruited them and directed the home invasion. Carty's defense team argued that she was being scapegoated by the real perpetrators. They claimed that the 3 men had committed the incidents on their own and were blaming Carty to reduce their own sentences. But the evidence showed that Carty had been found with the baby and had been asking about newborns before the kidnapping occurred. The trial focused heavily on Carty's personal life and behavior, with prosecutors painting her as a desperate woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. They argued that she had coldly planned the taking of an innocent mother's life just to steal her baby for her own selfish purposes. In February 2002, the jury found Lynda Carty guilty of capital offense and sentenced her to death by lethal injection. She became the only British citizen on Texas death row, creating diplomatic complications between the United States and Great Britain. Carty could become the first British woman to be executed in the USA since Ruth Ellis in 1955. The British government has repeatedly requested that her sentence be commuted to life imprisonment, citing opposition to the death penalty and concerns about the fairness of her trial. Carty has exhausted most of her appeals, with the Supreme Court turning down her case in 2018. However, affidavits recently supplied to Carty's defense team accuse prosecutors of using unethical tactics to ensure her conviction, providing new grounds for potential appeals. Carty remains on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Her case continues to generate international attention due to her British citizenship and ongoing questions about prosecutorial conduct during her trial. Whether she will ultimately be executed or receive a commutation remains uncertain, but her case has highlighted the international complications that can arise in capital cases. Kerry Lyn Dalton was a 28-year-old woman living in Live Oak Springs, California when her life became entangled with drugs, violence, and ultimately the most brutal offense that would land her on death row. Dalton had fallen into a world of methamphetamine use and criminal associates that would lead to unthinkable violence. In 1988, Dalton became convinced that 23-year-old Irene Melanie May had stolen her jewelry. May was a young woman who had become involved with Dalton's crowd of drug users and dealers. Whether May actually took anything from Dalton remains unclear, but Dalton's paranoid rage over the alleged theft would cost May her life. Dalton recruited 3 accomplices to help her get revenge against May: Mark Lee Tompkins, Cheryl Ann Baker, and a man known only as George agreed to participate in what Dalton planned as a punishment for May's supposed theft. What followed was one of the most horrific torture incidents in California history. On June 22, 1988, Dalton and her accomplices lured May to a remote location in Live Oak Springs. They told May they wanted to talk to her about the missing jewelry, but their real plan was to torture her until she confessed and told them where the stolen items were located. The attack that followed lasted for hours and involved unimaginable cruelty. Dalton and her accomplices used multiple weapons to torture May, including a cast-iron frying pan, knives, and even a syringe filled with battery acid. May was beaten, stabbed, and subjected to electric shocks while her attackers demanded information about the jewelry. The torture was methodical and prolonged. May was injected with battery acid, which caused excruciating pain as it burned her from the inside. She was beaten repeatedly with the cast-iron pan and stabbed multiple times with knives. The attackers also used electrical devices to shock May, adding another layer of agony to her suffering. May begged for her life and insisted she had not stolen anything from Dalton, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Dalton showed no mercy as she orchestrated the torture, believing that May was lying about the theft. The violence continued for hours with no regard for May's desperate screams and suffering. Eventually, May succumbed to the massive trauma inflicted on her body. She passed away from the combination of injuries, including the internal damage from the battery acid injection and the external trauma from the beatings and stabbings. Her body was so severely damaged that identifying the exact cause of death was difficult. After May passed away, Dalton and her accomplices disposed of her body in the remote desert area of Live Oak Springs. They believed that the isolated location would prevent the body from being discovered, allowing them to escape consequences for their actions. May's remains have never been found, despite extensive searches by law enforcement. The investigation began when May was reported missing by concerned family members. Police learned about her involvement with Dalton's drug-using associates and quickly focused on Dalton as a suspect. Witnesses came forward describing the threats Dalton had made against May over the alleged theft. Dalton's accomplices eventually confessed to their roles in the torture and offense. They provided detailed accounts of how Dalton had planned and directed the attack on May. Their testimony painted Dalton as the mastermind who had recruited them specifically to help torture May until she revealed where the jewelry was hidden. The prosecution built their case around the testimony of Dalton's co-defendants and physical evidence linking her to May's disappearance. They argued that Dalton had orchestrated the torture offense out of paranoid rage over stolen property, showing a complete disregard for human life in pursuit of revenge. Dalton maintained her innocence throughout the investigation and trial. She claimed that she had been framed by her co-defendants and that she had no involvement in May's disappearance or death. Dalton argued that the real perpetrators were trying to shift blame onto her to reduce their own sentences. During her trial, Dalton's defense team tried to portray her as a scapegoat who was being blamed for incidents committed by others. They argued that the co-defendants' testimony was unreliable because they had plea agreements that gave them incentives to lie. The defense claimed that Dalton was an easy target because of her drug use and association with the actual offenders. But the prosecution presented evidence showing that multiple witnesses had heard Dalton making threats against May over the alleged theft. They demonstrated that Dalton had both motive and opportunity to harm May, and that she had been seen with May on the day she disappeared. The case was complicated by the fact that May's body was never found, requiring the prosecution to prove that she was deceased without physical remains. They relied on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence to establish that May had been unalived rather than simply disappeared. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Kerry Lyn Dalton guilty of first-degree offense with special circumstances of torture and lying in wait. The torture special circumstance was based on evidence that May had been subjected to extreme physical and psychological suffering before her death. During the penalty phase, the prosecution emphasized the extraordinary cruelty of May's death and Dalton's role in orchestrating the torture. They argued that Dalton had shown complete disregard for human life and deserved the ultimate punishment for her actions. Dalton was sentenced to death by lethal injection and sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She has been on death row for over 35 years, making her one of the longest-serving women on California's death row. Dalton's case has attracted some supporters who believe she may be innocent and was wrongfully convicted based on the testimony of co-defendants seeking plea deals. Her sister has become an advocate for her case, arguing that Dalton was framed and did not receive a fair trial. Dalton continues to maintain her innocence and has exhausted most of her appeals through the California court system. Her case remains controversial due to questions about the reliability of co-defendant testimony and the lack of physical evidence linking her directly to the offense. Brenda Andrew was a 39-year-old married mother of two living in Oklahoma City when her marriage began falling apart in 2001. She was married to Rob Andrew, a successful businessman and insurance agent who was well respected in their community. But behind their seemingly perfect suburban life, Brenda was growing increasingly unhappy with her marriage. Rob Andrew worked as an insurance salesman and was setting up his own life insurance policy worth $800,000 in 2001. The couple had 2 young children together, but their relationship was deteriorating. Brenda felt trapped in her marriage and wanted freedom to pursue other relationships. Brenda began having an affair with James Pavat, a man who worked in the insurance industry and was helping Rob set up his life insurance policies. Brenda and Rob were separated, and she was openly dating Pavat. The affair was not a secret, and Rob knew about Brenda's relationship with his business associate. The Andrews filed for divorce in November 2001, but the process was contentious. Rob wanted custody of their children and was fighting Brenda for control of their assets. Brenda realized that she would likely receive much more money if Rob was deceased than if they divorced, especially with his substantial life insurance policy. The prosecution alleged that Brenda Andrew and her boyfriend James Pavat plotted Rob's offense to collect on the life insurance policy. They began planning how to eliminate Rob and make it look like a random incident or robbery gone wrong. On November 20, 2001, Rob went to pick up his children for Thanksgiving when he was shot and ended in the garage of the family home. Brenda, who was also shot in the arm during the incident, told police that 2 armed men had committed the shooting. She claimed to be another individual affected of the random violence. Brenda's story was that she and Rob had been attacked by unknown intruders who had broken into their home. She said the men had demanded money, and when Rob tried to resist, they had shot both of them. Brenda claimed her arm wound showed that she was also a target of the violence, not a participant in it. But investigators quickly became suspicious of Brenda's account. The scene did not look like a typical home invasion or robbery. Nothing of significant value had been stolen, and the attack seemed specifically targeted at Rob. Brenda's wound was minor and appeared to be self-inflicted or staged. The investigation revealed that Brenda and Pavat had been planning Rob's death for some time. Pavat eventually confessed to shooting Rob and initially told police he acted alone. But investigators believed that Brenda had been involved in planning the offense and had recruited Pavat to carry it out. Prosecutors weren't satisfied with just charging Pavat and also wanted Brenda, charging her with being part of the plot with Pavat to take her husband's life and collect the life insurance money. They argued that Brenda was the mastermind behind the scheme and had used her relationship with Pavat to convince him to commit the offense. The evidence against Brenda included her affair with Pavat, her knowledge of Rob's life insurance policies, and the suspicious circumstances of the shooting. Investigators also found that Brenda had been researching the insurance policies and had asked specific questions about how quickly they would pay out after Rob's death. Brenda was arrested and charged with first-degree offense and conspiracy. The prosecution argued that this was a plot with her lover to collect on Rob's $800,000 life insurance policy. They presented evidence showing that Brenda had motive, means, and opportunity to orchestrate her husband's death. The trial in 2004 became controversial because prosecutors focused heavily on Brenda's sexual behavior and extramarital affair. Critics argued that Brenda was essentially slut-shamed by prosecutors who used her affair and personal life to paint her as an immoral woman, capable of offense. Brenda had no prior criminal record, and Rob's death bore few of the hallmarks of a typical capital case. The evidence against her was largely circumstantial, relying heavily on her relationship with Pavat and the financial motive provided by the life insurance policy. Despite the questionable evidence and prosecutorial tactics, a jury convicted Brenda Andrew of first-degree offense and sentenced her to death. Pavat was also convicted and received the death penalty, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Brenda Andrew became the only woman on death row in Oklahoma, where she has remained for over 20 years. Her case has attracted significant attention from advocates who believe she was wrongfully convicted based on gender bias and prosecutorial misconduct. In January 2025, the Supreme Court ordered lower courts to review Brenda's case, potentially granting her a new trial. The Supreme Court's order specifically addressed concerns about the use of evidence regarding her sexual history during the trial. The Supreme Court's decision to review Brenda's case suggests that there may have been significant legal errors in her original trial. Her supporters argue that she was convicted based on outdated gender stereotypes rather than solid evidence, and that the focus on her extramarital affair prejudiced the jury against her. Brenda remains on death row at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in McLeod, Oklahoma, while her case proceeds through the appeals process. Whether she will ultimately receive a new trial or face execution remains to be seen, but her case has become a symbol of how gender bias can influence capital punishment cases. MAUREEN McDermott was a 36-year-old licensed vocational nurse living in Van Nuys, California when financial pressures and greed led her to orchestrate one of the most calculated contract offenses in the state's history. McDermott worked at hospitals and medical facilities, presenting herself as a caring healthcare professional while secretly planning the death of her housemate for financial gain. McDermott shared a home with 27-year-old Stephen Eldridge, and the two had a complex financial arrangement. They co-owned the property together, and McDermott had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Eldridge without his knowledge. The policy was supposedly for mortgage protection, but McDermott had much darker plans for how she would collect on it. By 1985, McDermott was facing severe financial problems and saw Eldridge's life insurance policy as the solution to her troubles. She began planning his offense, but she did not want to carry out the attack herself. Instead, McDermott decided to hire someone else to take Eldridge's life so she could maintain her innocence while collecting the insurance money. McDermott found her hitman through her work connections at the hospital. She approached Jimmy Luna, a hospital orderly who needed money and was willing to commit violence for pay. McDermott offered Luna $50,000 to eliminate Eldridge, promising him a substantial payday for carrying out the offense. McDermott was very specific about how she wanted Eldridge unalived. She told Luna that Eldridge needed to be stabbed because a gun would make too much noise and might attract attention from neighbors. McDermott wanted the attack to appear random and not connected to her, so she gave Luna detailed instructions about how to carry out the offense. The plan was for Luna to break into the house when McDermott was not home, making it look like a burglary gone wrong. McDermott would establish an alibi for herself while Luna carried out the attack. She gave Luna information about Eldridge's schedule and the layout of the house to help him plan the assault. But McDermott's first attempt to have Eldridge unalived was unsuccessful. In March 1985, Luna broke into the house and attacked Eldridge, stabbing him multiple times. However, Eldridge survived the assault and was hospitalized with serious injuries. The attack appeared to be a random home invasion, and police had no reason to suspect MCDERMOTT's involvement. McDermott realized that Eldridge's survival posed a problem for her plans. As long as he was alive, she could not collect on his life insurance policy. She decided that Luna needed to finish the job and complete the offense that he had botched during his first attempt. On April 28, 1985, Luna returned to the house for a second attack on Eldridge. This time he was more thorough and brutal in his assault. Luna stabbed Eldridge multiple times in a vicious attack that ensured he would not survive. Eldridge was found deceased in his home, apparently the individual affected of another random burglary and assault. The investigation into Eldridge's death initially focused on the possibility of a random home invasion. Police had no reason to suspect that his housemate had orchestrated his offense. McDermott played the role of a grieving friend who was shocked by the violence that had occurred in her home. But Luna's behavior after the offense raised suspicions among investigators. He was spending money freely and acting nervous when questioned about his whereabouts on the night of the attack. Police began to investigate Luna more closely and discovered his connection to MCDERMOTT through the hospital where they both worked. Under pressure from police, Luna eventually confessed to the offense and implicated MCDERMOTT as the person who had hired him. He provided detailed information about how MCDERMOTT had recruited him, paid him, and instructed him on how to carry out the attacks on Eldridge. The investigation revealed that McDermott had been the mastermind behind both attacks on Eldridge. She had planned the entire scheme to collect on his life insurance policy and had used Luna as her weapon to carry out the violence. Police discovered evidence of the insurance policy and McDermott's financial problems, providing clear motive for the offense. McDermott was arrested and charged with first-degree offense for hire, attempted offense, and conspiracy. The prosecution argued that she had coldly planned Eldridge's death for financial gain and had shown complete disregard for human life in pursuit of money. During her trial in 1989, MCDERMOTT maintained her innocence and claimed that Luna was lying about her involvement. She argued that Luna had acted on his own and was trying to implicate her to reduce his own sentence. MCDERMOTT portrayed herself as an innocent victim who was being framed by the real perpetrator. But the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of MCDERMOTT's guilt, including the insurance policy, her financial problems, and Luna's detailed testimony about how she had recruited and directed him. They demonstrated that MCDERMOTT had both motive and opportunity to orchestrate Eldridge's offense. The evidence showed that MCDERMOTT had been the driving force behind the attacks on Eldridge. She had recruited Luna, provided him with information and instructions, and paid him for his services. The prosecution argued that she was more culpable than Luna because she had planned and initiated the entire scheme. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found MAUREEN MCDERMOTT guilty of first-degree offense, attempted offense, and conspiracy. During the penalty phase, the prosecution emphasized that MCDERMOTT had violated the most basic trust by hiring someone to take the life of her housemate for money. On June 8, 1990, MCDERMOTT was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming one of the few women on California's death row. Luna was convicted of first-degree offense but received a life sentence in exchange for his cooperation against MCDERMOTT. MCDERMOTT has been on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla for over 35 years. Her appeals have been largely unsuccessful, with courts consistently upholding her conviction and sentence. She remains one of the longest-serving women on California's death row. Cynthia Coffman was a 24-year-old mother of 4 from St. Louis, Missouri when she met James Gregory Marlowe in May 1986. Coffman had been married but was drawn to Marlowe, an ex-convict known as the Folsom Wolf, because of his time in Folsom Correctional Facility. Marlowe was a dangerous man with a history of violence, but Coffman was infatuated with him. Within days of meeting Marlowe, Coffman abandoned her husband and children to go on a cross-country road trip with her new boyfriend. She left behind her 4 young children and the stability of her previous life to follow Marlowe on what would become a deadly journey across multiple states. Marlowe and Coffman began their relationship by committing petty incidents and robberies to fund their travels. But Marlowe had more sinister plans that went beyond simple theft. He was a sexual predator who enjoyed inflicting pain and domination over young women. Coffman would soon become not just his girlfriend but his accomplice in a series of horrific incidents. The couple's crime spree began in October 1986 when they started targeting young women for robbery, sexual assault, and offense. They would approach individuals who appeared vulnerable, often offering rides or assistance before attacking them. Marlowe was the primary perpetrator of the violence, but Coffman participated willingly and helped him carry out his plans. Their first known individual affected was 20-year-old Corinna Novis, who was abducted from Huntington Beach, California on November 7, 1986. Novis was a young woman who had been walking alone when Marlowe and Coffman approached her. They convinced her to get in their car, claiming they would give her a ride to safety. Once Novis was in their vehicle, Marlowe and Coffman drove her to a remote location where Marlowe sexually assaulted her while Coffman watched and participated. The attack was prolonged and brutal, with Novis being subjected to horrific abuse before finally being strangled to death. Her body was found days later in the desert. The couple's second known individual affected was 19-year-old Lionel Murray, who was abducted from Blythe, California on November 14, 1986. Like Novis, Murray was young and vulnerable when Marlowe and Coffman targeted her. They used the same tactics, convincing Murray to trust them before taking her to a remote location. Murray suffered the same fate as Novis, being sexually assaulted and tortured before being strangled to death. The pattern was clear. Marlowe enjoyed the power and control he had over these young women, while Coffman served as his willing accomplice in carrying out these horrific attacks. The investigation into the incidents began when the bodies of Novis and Murray were discovered. Both women had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and both had been found in remote desert locations. Police realized they were looking for a couple who was targeting young women across California. Witnesses came forward who had seen Marlowe and Coffman with both individuals affected before their disappearances. Descriptions of their vehicle and their appearance led police to identify them as suspects. A massive manhunt was launched to find the couple before they could claim more individuals affected. Marlowe and Coffman were eventually arrested in Arizona, ending their deadly spree. When questioned by police, both tried to blame each other for the incidents. Marlowe claimed that Coffman had encouraged him to hurt the women, while Coffman claimed that Marlowe had forced her to participate under threat of violence. During the investigation, police discovered that Marlowe and Coffman had likely unalived additional individuals during their cross-country crime spree. They were suspected of taking the lives of women in multiple states, making them one of the most prolific killing couples in recent history. Coffman was charged with capital offense in the deaths of Novice and Murray. The prosecution argued that she was an active participant in the incidents, not just a passive bystander. They presented evidence showing that Coffman had helped lure the individuals affected into their vehicle and had participated in the attacks that followed. During her trial in 1989, Coffman's defense team tried to argue that she was a battered woman who had been coerced by Marlowe into participating in the incidents. They claimed that Coffman suffered from battered woman syndrome and that she feared for her own life if she did not cooperate with Marlowe's demands. The defense portrayed Coffman as another one of Marlowe's individuals affected, arguing that she had been manipulated and controlled by him. They claimed that Coffman would never have committed these incidents on her own and that she was only involved because of Marlowe's influence over her. But the prosecution argued that Coffman was a willing participant who had abandoned her children and husband to join Marlowe on his crime spree. They pointed out that Coffman had multiple opportunities to escape or seek help, but had chosen to stay with Marlowe and participate in the violence. The evidence showed that Coffman had been present during the attacks and had helped Marlowe carry them out. Witness testimony indicated that she had been an active participant, not just a terrified bystander. The prosecution argued that Coffman deserved the same punishment as Marlowe for her role in these horrific incidents. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Cynthia Coffman guilty of a first-degree offense with special circumstances. On August 30, 1989, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming the first woman to receive a death sentence in California since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1977. Marlowe was also convicted and sentenced to death for his role in the incidents. Both defendants have spent decades on death row appealing their convictions and sentences. Coffman has consistently maintained that she was a battered woman who was forced to participate in the violence. Coffman remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she has been for over 35 years. Her case continues to raise questions about domestic violence, coercion, and the extent to which someone can be held responsible for incidents committed under the influence of an abusive partner. Kimberly Diane Cargill was a 39-year-old mother living in White House, Texas, who seemed to have her life together on the surface. She worked as an office clerk and had children from previous relationships. But by 2010, Cargill was facing serious problems that would lead her to commit an unthinkable act. Child Protective Services had launched an investigation into Cargill for allegations of child abuse. The investigation was serious enough that she had already lost custody of one of her children, who was placed with Cargill's mother. CPS workers were building a case against her, and Cargill knew that more of her children could be taken away. To help care for her remaining sons, Luke and Zach, Cargill hired 39-year-old Cherry Walker as a babysitter. Walker was a gentle woman with developmental disabilities, who was known for being kind, honest, and trustworthy. She had been caring for Cargill's children and had witnessed concerning behavior that could be used as evidence in the CPS investigation. As the CPS case proceeded, Walker was scheduled to testify at a custody hearing about what she had observed while babysitting Cargill's children. Walker was known for being incapable of lying, which made her testimony particularly dangerous for Cargill. If Walker told the truth about what she had seen, Cargill could lose custody of all her remaining children. Cargill decided that Walker had to be silenced permanently. On June 18, 2010, she put her deadly plan into action. Cargill picked up Walker under the pretense of taking her somewhere but instead drove her to a remote area in rural Smith County, Texas. What happened next was brutal and calculated. Cargill attacked Walker, beating her and causing severe injuries. Walker, who was mentally challenged and trusting, probably never understood why someone she had tried to help was hurting her. Cargill then took Walker's life to prevent her from testifying, but Cargill was not finished with her horrific plan. To destroy evidence and make identification difficult, she doused Walker's body with gasoline and set it on fire. The flames consumed most of the evidence, but Cargill's plan was not perfect. She left behind clues that would eventually lead investigators directly to her. Walker's burned remains were discovered in a remote area of Smith County. The scene was so disturbing that even experienced investigators were shaken. The medical examiner determined that Walker had been unalived before her body was burned, ruling out the possibility that this was an accidental death. The investigation quickly focused on people who had recent contact with Walker. Cargill's name came up immediately, because of her connection to Walker as her employer. When investigators learned about the upcoming CPS hearing and Walker's scheduled testimony, Cargill became the prime suspect. Police found evidence linking Cargill to the crime scene. Cell phone records showed she was in the area where Walker's body was found. Forensic evidence connected her to the location, and witnesses had seen her with Walker on the day she disappeared. Cargill's attempts to create an alibi fell apart under investigation. Cargill was arrested and charged with a capital offense. The prosecution had a strong case showing that she had motive, means, and opportunity to take Walker's life. They argued that Cargill unalived Walker specifically to prevent her testimony in the CPS case, making it a calculated act of witness elimination. During her trial in 2012, Cargill tried to claim that Walker had died from a seizure while in her care, and that she had panicked and burned the body to hide what she thought would look like negligence. But the medical evidence contradicted her story. Walker had been beaten to death, not suffered a medical emergency. The prosecution presented evidence showing Cargill's pattern of child abuse and her desperate situation with CPS. They demonstrated how Walker's testimony would have been devastating to Cargill's custody case. Phone records, forensic evidence, and witness testimony all pointed to Cargill as Walker's offender. Cargill's defense team tried to portray her as a woman who had suffered childhood sexual abuse and was struggling with mental health issues. They argued that her troubled past had led to poor decision-making, but they could not overcome the evidence showing premeditated offense. The jury found Kimberly Cargill guilty of a capital offense on May 18, 2012. During the penalty phase, the prosecution emphasized that Cargill had unalived a vulnerable woman who was mentally disabled, and had trusted her. They argued that she deserved the ultimate punishment for taking advantage of Walker's disability and trust. On June 7, 2012, Cargill was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became one of the few women on Texas's death row. The judge and jury agreed that her offense was particularly heinous because she had targeted a disabled individual who posed no physical threat to her. Cargill has been housed at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, since her sentencing. She has filed multiple appeals challenging her conviction and sentence, but has been unsuccessful. Her case stands as an example of how far someone will go to avoid accountability, even if it means taking the life of an innocent person who trusted them. Erica Yvonne Sheppard was just 19 years old in 1993 when her life took a tragic turn that would land her on death row. Growing up in Houston, Texas, Erica had suffered severe abuse throughout her childhood. She was a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, and had endured years of trauma that left her mentally ill and vulnerable. By 1993, Erica was homeless with 3 young children. She had been living in an abusive relationship and was desperately trying to escape. Erica sought help from a women's shelter, hoping to find safety for herself and her children, but the shelter would not accept her, leaving her with nowhere to turn. Erica was involved with James Dickerson, a man with a criminal history who was also struggling with homelessness. Dickerson had HIV/AIDS and was facing his own health and financial problems. Together they were living on the streets and looking for ways to survive. On June 30, 1993, Dickerson convinced Erica to accompany him on what he said would be a robbery. Erica later claimed she did not know Dickerson planned to hurt anyone and thought they were just going to steal money or items they could sell. She was young, scared, and following someone who had power over her. Their target was 43-year-old Marilyn Sage Meagher, a real estate agent and mother of two who lived in a Galleria area apartment in Houston. Meagher was a successful professional who worked hard to support her family. She had no connection to Dickerson or Erica, and was chosen seemingly at random as their target. Dickerson and Erica entered Meagher's apartment under false pretenses. What started as a robbery quickly turned violent when Dickerson decided to eliminate any witness to their incident. Meagher was beaten, stabbed, and strangled in her own home in what became an extraordinarily brutal attack. Erica later testified that she tried to stop Dickerson from hurting Meagher, but she was powerless to prevent the violence. She claimed that Dickerson threatened to harm her children if she tried to leave or call for help. Erica said she was terrified of Dickerson and feared for her own life during the attack. Meagher fought desperately for her life, but the attack was too vicious for her to survive. She was found deceased in a spare bedroom by her daughter the next day. The scene was horrific, with evidence of the prolonged violence that had taken place. The investigation quickly led police to Dickerson and Erica. They were arrested and charged with capital offense for Meagher's death during the course of a robbery. Both faced the possibility of the death penalty for their roles in the incident. Erica's trial revealed the extent of the abuse and trauma she had suffered throughout her life. Defense experts testified about her history of sexual assault, domestic violence, and mental illness. They argued that Erica was a victim who had been coerced into participating in the incident by Dickerson. But the prosecution argued that Erica was an active participant in the robbery and offense, not just an unwilling accomplice. They presented evidence showing that Erica had been present during the attack and had done nothing to stop it or call for help. They argued that she deserved the same punishment as Dickerson. The trial took place during a time when there was less understanding about domestic violence, coercive control, and trauma-induced compliance. Erica's court-appointed attorneys did not adequately present evidence about her vulnerability or the psychological factors that had led to her involvement in the incident. Erica's case was also complicated by Texas law regarding accomplice liability. Under the law of parties, someone who participates in a felony offense can be held equally responsible for any deaths that occur, even if they did not directly cause the death. This meant Erica could receive the death penalty, even if Dickerson was the one who actually unalived Meagher. On March 3, 1995, Erica Sheppard was convicted of capital offense and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Dickerson was also convicted and sentenced to death. At just 21 years old when sentenced, Erica became one of the youngest women on Texas death row. Dickerson never faced execution because he passed away from AIDS-related complications while on death row in 1999. But Erica has remained on death row for over 25 years, fighting for her life through the appeals process. Erica's case has attracted attention from advocates who argue that she was a victim of the system rather than a true perpetrator. They point to her history of abuse, her young age, and the coercive relationship with Dickerson as factors that should have prevented her from receiving the death penalty. Supporters argue that Erica represents the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. A young woman with severe trauma who was manipulated into participating in an incident she never intended to happen. They believe her death sentence reflects a failure to understand the complex dynamics of abuse and coercion. Erica has spent her time on death row finding religion and trying to make amends for her role in Meagher's death. She has expressed remorse for what happened and has worked to help other incarcerated women who have similar backgrounds of abuse and trauma. Erica remains on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She continues to fight her case through the appeals process, with advocates arguing that her sentence should be commuted to life imprisonment based on her history of victimization and the circumstances of her involvement in the offense. Melissa Lucio was a 38-year-old mother of 14 living in Harlingen, Texas, when her life changed forever on February 17, 2007. Raised in severe poverty and abuse, she suffered physical, emotional, and sexual violence from a young age. Diagnosed with PTSD, depression, and intellectual disabilities, she was highly vulnerable to manipulation. Her 2-year-old daughter Maria was a bright, active toddler adored by her siblings. On February 15, 2007, Maria fell down a steep staircase at their apartment. Melissa and several children saw the fall, which at first seemed minor. Over the next 2 days, however, Maria grew increasingly lethargic. On February 17, Melissa found her unresponsive and called 911. Paramedics rushed Maria to the hospital, but she was pronounced deceased, leaving the family devastated. The medical examiner ruled Maria died from blunt force trauma and also found an older broken arm plus internal bruising. Investigators quickly suspected child abuse and focused on Melissa. She repeatedly said Maria fell down the stairs and that she never harmed her, but police dismissed her explanation. Her interrogation became central to the case. For over 5 hours, investigators pressured Melissa to confess. She denied harming Maria 86 times verbally and 35 times by shaking her head. Experts later testified that people with her trauma background are highly prone to false confessions under coercive questioning. Exhausted and confused, Melissa eventually made fragmented statements police took as admissions. Though inconsistent, they were enough to charge her with a capital offense. At her 2008 trial, prosecutors argued Maria's injuries could only come from abuse. They claimed Melissa had a history of mistreating her children and went too far with Maria. Her court-appointed lawyer, inexperienced in capital cases, failed to call experts who could explain how the injuries fit a fall or show how her mental health made her vulnerable to coercion. The prosecution leaned heavily on her interrogation statements. The jury never heard alternative explanations or evidence of false confessions. After brief deliberations, they found Melissa guilty of a capital offense on July 10, 2008. During sentencing, the prosecution insisted she deserved death for taking her child's life. The defense offered little mitigating evidence, and Melissa was sentenced to lethal injection, later moved to Texas's Mountain View unit. She has maintained her innocence ever since. Her case soon drew attention from advocates and experts. New evidence showed Maria's injuries were consistent with a fall, not ongoing abuse. Biomechanics specialists testified the patterns matched stair trauma, and the broken arm was older and unrelated. Legal experts concluded her confession was coerced. In 2022, as her execution neared, public pressure and new evidence won her a stay. Celebrities, advocacy groups, and medical experts argued she was innocent. In November 2024, the original trial judge declared Melissa actually innocent, recommending her conviction and sentence be overturned, citing clear proof Maria's death was accidental and her confession coerced. Melissa remains on death row as appeals continue. Her case highlights the dangers of capital punishment, wrongful convictions, and how vulnerable people can be pushed into false confessions. Whether she will ultimately be exonerated remains uncertain, but her story stands as one of the most powerful examples of possible innocence on death row. Wendi Andriano was a 30-year-old wife and mother living in Waukee, Arizona when her world began to change dramatically. Her husband Joseph Andriano Jr., who was just 33 years old, had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. The diagnosis came at a difficult time, or Wendi was pregnant with their second child. Joe's cancer was terminal, and doctors gave him only a short time to live. The young family faced enormous medical bills and emotional stress as they dealt with his illness. Wendi appeared to be a devoted wife, caring for Joe during his treatment and preparing for the birth of their second child. But underneath her caring exterior, Wendi was growing resentful of the burden of caring for her dying husband. She was also having an affair with another man, and had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Jo. As Jo's condition worsened, Wendi began planning to speed up his death. On the night of October 8, 2000, Wendi put her deadly plan into action. She first attempted to poison Jo by giving him sodium azide, a dangerous pesticide that can cause heart failure and death. Wendi mixed the poison into Jo's food and drinks, hoping it would appear that he had died from his cancer. But the poisoning attempt was not working fast enough for Wendi's liking. Jo became violently ill, but did not pass away immediately. Frustrated and impatient, Wendi decided to take more direct action. She armed herself with a large kitchen knife and a metal bar stool. In the early morning hours of October 8, Wendi launched a brutal attack on her helpless husband. Jo was weak from both his cancer and the poisoning, making him unable to defend himself. Wendi showed no mercy to the man who had trusted her to care for him in his final days. Wendi stabbed Jo in the neck with a 13-inch knife, severing his carotid artery. But she was not finished with her assault. She then beat him repeatedly with a metal bar stool, striking him at least 23 times in the head. The blows caused massive brain hemorrhaging and skull fractures. After the attack, Wendi called 911 and claimed that Jo had tried to take his own life. She told emergency operators that her husband had been depressed about his cancer diagnosis and had attempted to end his own life. Wendi tried to portray herself as a devastated wife who had discovered her husband's body, but investigators immediately suspected that Wendi's story was false. The injuries to Jo's body were not consistent with self-infliction. The multiple blows to his head and the stab wound to his neck indicated that someone else had attacked him. The broken bar stool near his body provided additional evidence of violence. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed the full extent of Jo's injuries and confirmed that he had been unalived by another person. The presence of sodium azide in his system indicated that someone had also tried to poison him. All evidence pointed to Wendi as the perpetrator. During the investigation, police learned about Wendi's affair and the life insurance policy she had taken out on Jo. They also discovered that she had purchased sodium azide shortly before Jo's death, claiming she needed it for work purposes. Wendi's financial records showed she was deeply in debt and needed money desperately. Wendi was arrested and charged with a first-degree offense. The prosecution argued that she had unalived Jo for financial gain and to be free to pursue her relationship with her lover. They presented evidence showing that Wendi had planned the attack and had first tried to poison her husband before resorting to physical violence. During her trial in 2004, Wendi's defense team tried to portray her as a devoted wife who had been overwhelmed by the stress of caring for a terminally ill husband. They argued that Jo's cancer had caused him to become violent and abusive, and that Wendi had acted in self-defense. But the evidence contradicted the defense claims. Jo had been weak and bedridden from his cancer treatment, making it impossible for him to pose a physical threat to Wendi. The multiple injuries to his head and the evidence of poisoning showed clear premeditation on Wendi's part. The prosecution emphasized that Wendi had betrayed the most sacred trust between spouses. Instead of caring for Jo in his final days, she had chosen to take his life for money and freedom. They argued that her actions were especially heinous because Jo had been helpless and had trusted her completely. After a 17-week trial, the jury found Wendi Andriano guilty of a first-degree offense on December 22, 2004. During the penalty phase, they recommended death after deliberating for only 8 hours. The judge agreed and sentenced Wendi to death by lethal injection. Wendi has been on Arizona's death row for over 20 years and is housed at the Lumley Unit in the Arizona State Correctional Facility complex in Perryville. She has exhausted most of her appeals and remains one of only 3 women on Arizona's death row. Her case serves as a chilling reminder of how greed and selfishness can lead someone to betray their most sacred relationships.